Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Quantitative Methods Writing Chapters 3 and 4 webinar from the Dissertation Writing Circle. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Mike Corcoran, who is an assistant professor at Widener University. Dr. Corcoran earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Widener, his Master's of Arts in Industrial and Organizational Psychology from Westchester University, and his Ph.D. in Social and Personality Psychology from the University of Missouri. Dr. Corcoran's background spans both applied and academic domains. His research interests in pedagogy reflect his varied background and experiences, diverse with applications in both theoretical and applied areas. His research interests include well-being, goals, and motivation and personality. He's also active in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Corcoran, who's going to share his presentation with us, and then we're going to have some time for questions and answers after his presentation. So Dr. Corcoran, I will turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jake. And I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. I know it's, 7 o'clock, well, at least where I'm at, on a weekday, on a Monday of all days too. So I really appreciate you being here, and I'm happy to be presenting this to you all. So let me get started real quick. So again, as Jake had introduced, I'm Dr. Mike Corcoran. I'm assistant professor here at Widener University, which is right outside Philadelphia. And I just also wanted to give you my email too. So feel free at any point, if any questions come up, after the fact, after this presentation, anything like that, you can feel free to email me. So today, really what we're here to talk about are the methods and the results section of your dissertation. And one of the things I want to start off with is really thinking about how people think about these things. So I'm not going to ask you to, put your hand up or anything, or put anything in the chat in regards to this question, but you can see I have this question here. What are some words or general thoughts that kind of the methods and results recall? And the reason why I don't need your input on this is because I've taught many courses in research methods and talking about results, and I can tell you basically the general sentiment that I get from a lot of students, and I've made kind of a word cloud of that, and you can see some of those. I'll read some of them off to you. So some that I see more often than not are things like anxiety inducing, uninspiring, stressful, bland, apprehensive, maybe even to approach them, scary, maybe fearful. And these are things that I'm probably sure some of you have maybe felt before, maybe at other points in your dissertation process, but probably also when thinking about the results and methods sections. And I want to say that I understand the sources of these feelings. I've been in that position before. I've been, trying to learn statistics, how to write up statistics, things like that. And I understand that kind of apprehension or that fear or that anxiety that comes with it. And some of the reasons, that I've seen with people before, the reasons why they might not like these sections or might be apprehensive about them. Well, first one, really big one that I think of is numbers are scary. We find that people, particularly when we're talking about quantitative research, just the sheer amount of numbers that you have to know and that you have to understand and be able to extrapolate tend to be somewhat anxiety producing. I do promise though, these numbers can't hurt you, and that really, at the end of the day, I think one of the most empowering things to understand is that numbers really don't tell the story. You tell the story that the numbers give you. You add the value to the data that you have. And I think that's a really important thing to understand when you're thinking about writing your methods and results section. And we'll talk about that a bit more. The other thing that I tend to find, the reason why people might not find these to be their favorite sections is because they're very technical. So this is going to be the most technical, probably, section of your paper. And in many ways, it stifles your creativity then. So in your introduction, when you're crafting your arguments, when you're finding your sources, when you're using logic for your hypotheses, you get to use a bit of creativity. You get to use that creative mind and really bring your own thoughts along with the research and evidence into research, which is really cool. But once you get to this part, the methods and results, you're not really able to do that as much. It's very technical. That being said, I really do hope to change your general sentiment about these things. Why is that? Why might I want to do that? Well, I have two big reasons for that. The first one is I want your dissertation journey to be as enjoyable as possible. So this series is called Thriving the Dissertation. I really want you to feel as though you are doing so. This should be really, in some senses, an enjoyable endeavor. Yes, it's going to be stressful. There's learning involved. There's a lot of work involved, but it should be an enjoyable endeavor. Second reason that I hope to change your sentiment is I truly believe, and I mean this wholeheartedly, that these sections of your paper are actually rather exciting. They may not seem that way because, again, they're very technical, but they really are exciting because these are the sections where you get to display your creativity through your methods and through your analysis. These are the sections where you get to present your evidence through your methods and through your analysis. So you can think this question that you've been pondering and researching for perhaps months, years at this point, this is the place where it finally has a semblance of an answer. And you get to present that to an audience beyond just yourself and your dissertation committee. And that is really cool and really exciting. So let's get a bit more into it, talk a bit deeper about each section, see kind of what makes each section a high quality section and what sort of things should be included in each. So what I want to start with, even before moving into that, is thinking about how these sections start. So the question I have here is, how do a high quality methods and results section start? And my answer to that would be is they start even before the methods and results section. Your methods and results section are going to be supported with well-specified hypotheses that are supported by a quality introduction. So we're going to talk about hypotheses just for a minute, just because I want to talk a bit about it so you can think about it as you're moving into your methods and results. So as you probably know already, I'm not going to go through this too much, but hypotheses are just a statement that articulate a plausible candidate explanation for a certain observation. General idea being we're making an educated guess as to what we expect to happen. And we all do this. This is all part of the dissertation process. And we actually do this on the day-to-day. We're always forming hypotheses about why people behave a certain way, perhaps, why you might feel a certain way. These are things that we kind of do naturally. But forming a good hypothesis is something that takes a little bit more effort. So a hypothesis itself, when we're talking about quantitative research, is one that is going to allow the gathering of data that can be used to support or refute that claim. So that plausible candidate explanation that you have, you should be able to gather data that can be used to either support or perhaps also refute that claim. So that's just what a general hypothesis is. And again, I'm sure you have some understanding of that. But we want to ask them, what makes good hypotheses? And I have a couple points that I think are really important to stress when you're thinking about creating your hypotheses. First, and I mentioned it a little bit on the previous slide, is that they should be well specified. Your hypotheses should explain exactly what you expect to happen. Now, obviously, we don't always need the full effect size that you expect, but it needs to be directional. That is, you need to make a prediction. You need to put the chips down on the table and you need to say, this is what I think is going to happen. and I think it's going to happen in this manner, in this, domain, or however specific your research study is. Next, we want to make sure that our hypotheses are also concise and clear. So many times what can happen is we can get many ideas in our head. Maybe we're trying to, make sure that our hypothesis is comprehensive enough, but we want to make sure that we avoid extraneous words. We want to state our hypothesis as simply and succinctly as possible. This will make it easier for our readers, obviously, but it also, going back to our previous point, ensures that our hypotheses are well specified. Because if they're well specified, we should be able to concisely and clearly state them. Similarly, then, if we find ourselves in a position where maybe our hypothesis cannot be clearly or concisely stated, then maybe we need multiple hypotheses. So, for example, we see this often when we think about perhaps a mediation, where we hypothesize a main effect. So we hypothesize that X variable is predictive of Y variable. And then that is mediated through a third variable. So that's to say, X causes changes in this third variable, which then causes changes in Y. We could state that as one hypothesis, but it's likely easier to just break that down into multiple hypotheses, both for the sake of our reader and also for the sake of clarity and specificity. Next is pretty obvious again and goes along with the definition. We want to make sure they're measurable and testable. We need to make sure that we actually have hypotheses that allow for the gathering of data and the testing of those hypotheses. And then finally, this one, again, might seem rather straightforward, but you got to remember, you are the one basically in this research. You are thinking about it deeply every day. Someday or sometimes when you go to write things up, you might assume that your reader has the knowledge that you have, and we have to assume that they don't. So we have to ensure, for example, that our hypotheses contain all the relevant variables for that specific hypothesis. So your hypothesis should include all the variables that are being tested in that given hypothesis. And this might include, multiple independent variables or multiple dependent variables, dependent on your hypothesis itself. So again, getting back to where we started here, methods and results start with well-specified hypotheses that are supported by a quality introduction. I just want to take a full stop here also, because there's another point that I want to bring up when we're thinking about these, when we're thinking about moving into the methods and hypotheses. And generally speaking, what we want to ensure is that the support and justification for your hypotheses comes before these sections. So again, if you're running multiple studies in one manuscript, you'll typically have kind of a discussion section between studies that allows perhaps for more support and justification for further hypotheses. But typically, what we want is to ensure that all of our support, all of our justification for our hypotheses come before these sections. So we don't want to spend time in the methods or in the results section explaining why we did a certain thing or why, our method is the way that it is. Our methods and results sections, again, are not for that. It's not to be able to justify your methods and analysis. If anything, the methods and results section of your paper should feel like a natural progression of your introduction and hypotheses. Basically, the idea should be is that when a reader gets to the end of your introduction, the hypotheses should be somewhat self-evident at that point. And then based off of the hypotheses that you form, there should be no question as to why you're utilizing a specific method or why you're utilizing a specific analysis. So if you find yourself getting to these sections, find yourself getting to the methods or results section, and you find yourself justifying your methods or justifying the analysis that you're running, chances are you probably should move that argument a bit earlier in your paper. You probably should spend more time earlier in your paper focusing on those things. So I want to now take some time, dive a little bit deeper into each of these sections, talk about some qualities of quality methods and results section. So when we talk about methods, again, very straightforward. They should describe exactly how the research was conducted. So there should be a specific section that's going to detail the characteristics of your sample and also how the sample was collected. So for example, this is typically called the participants section. And in this, we're going to include things like demographic information. We're also going to include our recruiting strategy. Where did you get your sample from? Also, in addition to that, was your sample compensated at all for their time or their participation in your study? All of these things are necessary and should be included in your methods section. Similarly, there should also be a section that specifically details how the study was ran itself. This is typically called the procedure or the measures section. They're typically combined with subheadings for each. And in the procedure, for example, you should have the full methodological progression described. Basic idea being, I should be able to read your procedure, know exactly what a participant went through participating in your study. On the same accord, I should also be able to read your methods section and then basically replicate the study that you ran based off of the information that you gave. Obviously, I'm going to have to gather more materials to do so, but I should be able to read that methods section, get an idea of exactly how you ran your study, and then be able to replicate that study myself. And any of your readers should be able to. The other thing is we want all of the measures that were part of your study, and they all need to be cited if they are from an external source. If you created them, you need to describe how you created them. And then you also need to describe them a little bit. So for example, what does it measure? How many items are on it? Did you use a Likert scale? If so, how many points were on your Likert scale? What were the scale ends? The other thing that we'd have described there in our measures would be things like means, standard deviations, and then also perhaps reliability if you have a scale that you're utilizing. So that's methods. Again, very technical section, very straightforward. Results, get a little bit more, get a little bit deeper, because this is where the statistical analysis performed to test the hypotheses are detailed. And sometimes we'll find that results sections will be broken up in multiple parts. And this is typically done when it's beneficial for the reader and also beneficial for comprehension. So for example, I'm going to bring up an excerpt from this study that I'm actually having my students read right now, looking at social media use and fitspiration, they call it. So exposure to basically inspiration to get fit on social media. And you can see in the study, they actually break up the results section into multiple different parts. Reason being is they have multiple hypotheses that they're testing. First, they're testing exposure and then individual differences on two different factors, social comparison orientation and regulatory focus. This is their first hypothesis, so it goes first in the results section and it gets its own section because it's a rather important part of the paper. Next, they go on to a moderating hypothesis. So they're looking at the moderating roles of those two variables we talked about prior. So social comparison orientation and regulatory focus. The reason why this makes sense to break up into two separate sections, well, I should say two subheadings, is again because it helps the reader understand, okay, this is what they ran for this specific hypothesis, and now these are the analyses that they ran for the more complex moderating hypothesis. This allows, again, for easier comprehension and then also easier for people to look through and see, okay, this goes with this hypothesis and this goes with that hypothesis. Another thing that often comes up in the results section, I understand, is people get the results, they start writing the results, and you get excited, particularly if you find what you've hypothesized. It's always an exciting feeling when you've made a prediction and you find support for it. Sometimes we'll find then that people will write extrapolations in the results section. That's not necessarily appropriate. What we should be doing in our results section is just making very basic statistical interpretations. So we make those very basic statistical interpretations, and then we leave any extrapolations beyond that for things like our discussion section. So again, extrapolations are saved for the discussion section of the manuscript. So again, I'll bring up just some text from this study. So Pasco and Arrigo, 2021. And this is an excerpt from the results section. So I'll read this to you. It says social comparison orientation was positively associated with feelings about the self after viewing Fitspiration, R equals 0.14, P equals 0.008, such that students with a stronger versus weaker comparison orientation experience more frequent negative feelings. In contrast, regulatory focus was inversely associated with feelings about the self after viewing Fitspiration, such that students with a stronger promotion focus experience more frequent positive feelings. R equals negative 0.13 and P equals 0.02. So you can see they're reporting their statistics, and this is an appropriate and expected in the results section. They're reporting and detailing the statistical analysis performed. They're providing the expected level of statistical reporting by APA standards, and they're only providing very brief, very basic extrapolations. They're saying, okay, these are the tests that we ran, and then this is basically what this means. So you can see, for example, they have the correlation there, and they just say, so for in the first paragraph, they have a positive correlation there, and they state that such that students with a stronger versus weaker comparison orientation experience more frequent negative feelings. This is basically the level of extrapolation that we want to make in a results section. Anything more we want to save for later in the paper. We don't want to extrapolate beyond the analysis itself in our results. So when I read this, I say, okay, this is a really good example of the level of extrapolation appropriate in the results. Now, I want to take now another excerpt from a little bit deeper in the paper here. So this is actually from their discussion section. So I'll read this to you again. So social comparison orientation was positively associated with feelings about the self after viewing Fitspiration, while regulatory focus was negatively associated with feelings about the self after viewing Fitspiration and positively associated with unintentional Fitspiration use. Both results are consistent with previous literature, which shows a stronger first weaker social comparison orientation is associated with worse self-reported mood after viewing others' social media posts. So this is what we would call an appropriate extrapolation of the previous statistical findings. It's adding more, utilizing logic, incorporating previous findings, and telling you a bit more as the reader what these findings mean. Again, this is something though, and they do this in this paper, so I will give them credit. I'm not saying they did this wrong. They did this 100% appropriate. This is something we'd find in the discussion section and more appropriate for the discussion section. So again, this level of extrapolation is found in the discussion section and what we would expect there rather than in the results section. So again, if you find yourself getting to the results and you're getting excited, and I understand that, you just want to make sure that, yes, you can write, you can extrapolate beyond what you find, you can use logic, you can incorporate previous findings, talk about how it supports your idea, but save those things for the discussion. Write them up, save them for the discussion. Results is just about what you found. So before we wrap up here a little bit with things, I do just want to talk a little bit more about these. And one other thing that I want to bring up is typically what I find also is that a lot of people kind of neglect these sections until they go to write them up. They wait until their study is designed, until the data is analyzed, to then go write up these sections. And again, I completely understand that. It makes a lot of sense. But what I want you to do is to think about these once you've selected your research questions and hypotheses, and perhaps sometimes even sooner. It's very important that even if you don't write up these sections in full yet, you should think about how you're going to write them up, at least have an outline maybe of how you're going to write them up, and then have an analysis plan for the data itself. The reason being is this is going to ensure that your study includes all the necessary elements. It's going to ensure that you include, for example, all of the measures that you need about your sample, so your demographic questions. It's going to ensure that you include all of the measures that you need to answer your hypotheses. And then lastly, probably the most important thing is it's going to ensure also that you have a plan and understand how you're going to analyze your data, and that analysis itself is going to test the hypothesis that you present. So I think it's extremely important that you consider those things before you even get to start writing them up. And then again, it also, so getting to that final point I talked about, ensures that you've fully considered your study. You've thought through it, you've thought the design, make sure that the design is testing the actual question and hypothesis that you have at hand, and that also that you have an analysis plan to be able to test that question. Nothing is going to be worse than if you run your study or you think your study is done and you're ready to run it, and then you're like, oh wait, how do I analyze this data? Or do I have everything that I need to be able to answer the question that I have? So again, I just think it's really important to attune yourself to these things very early on in the process and think about them to ensure that you've fully considered your study, you've included everything, and that you can adequately test your research question. All right, so that was basically it for me. I was told I have about a half hour. I think I got in right under a minute. So I want to turn it over to you at this point and see what questions that you have. And you can also drop them in the chat if you like. Jake said he's going to be monitoring the chat. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Hey, Paul, we can see you're trying to talk, but we can't hear you. Nope, still can't hear you. Do you want to try typing it in the chat?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Oh, I can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Can you hear me now, Paul?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you too. Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Perfect.
Yeah. I'm new to this. I mean, I'm just taking advanced right now. Quantitative. It seems that the language used for my model is moderated mediation. It seems like the language for the first three hypotheses is set in cement. Do it this way and only this way. Is that just because that's what they prefer, or is that the way it is?
It tends to be that that's the way it is. Yeah, because so you have a very complex quantitative model there. So moderated mediation, pretty complex model. And for that reason, yeah, it tends to be more technical, more just kind of fill in the blank sort of language. It might be, so in your case, it might be better to maybe break those into multiple hypotheses. So maybe you have one hypothesis that details the mediation itself, and then another hypothesis right after that that details how that moderation works in that mediation.
Okay. That's pretty much what it looks like anyway, but it seems that I've looked at 3 or 4 sources and a couple of papers, and they all seem to follow exactly the same format. Though I have noticed in my little tiny domain, the people who do publish in it seem to use one model on every single study that they've ever published, even if it's 100. It's exactly the same model. They just change the words and colors.
Yeah, and that's so, and it's funny too, because I think you see that a lot, that it's kind of an artifact of how people have had to run these analyses over the years. So you're probably seeing a lot what comes from the Barron and Kenny model, it's called. And I think I'll have to see if I can find the citation, but I can, if I remember it, I can send it to Jake maybe to send out. But it's one of the earliest citations dealing with moderated mediation and mediation in general, and the best way to run those given the statistical tools that we have at hand. So you do find people tend to write them the same, and yeah, they'll run the same models, particularly if you're asking similar questions.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. There,
Hi.
Oh yes, hi, how are you?
I have a question. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It's very full of insights. And I'm at this point where I have just submitted my proposal,
Exciting.
and it's been going, maybe it's a 3rd round now. I just submitted the 3rd round for a revision. And so it's a long and waiting game, like you know the drill. But my question now is, how do I write ahead on sections 4 and 5? Like, what do you suggest I write? Because I'm looking ahead at the other published dissertations, and I'm thinking maybe I could write ahead on this part and, just put the pieces together after I collected data?
Yeah, so I think that the discussion section is going to be a bit more difficult to write at this point if you don't have any data. You could at least anticipate, for example, some limitations already. Every study we run comes with limitations, comes with error, things that we consider and kind of accept when we go to run the study, because no study is perfect. So you probably could start writing a bit about those limitations, thinking about that. You could also think about perhaps some future directions. So if your study does support your hypothesis, then you could talk about, okay, what are maybe some things that researchers could do with this information? And even with that, say your hypotheses are not supported, which is disappointing, but it happens, then you can still utilize those parts to still write your discussion section. So the limitations should probably remain the same. If anything, you might add to them a little bit. And then you may have to reconfigure the future directions a little bit also. In terms of the results section, do you have like an analysis plan together already, or are you thinking about how you might analyze the data?
Well, no. Do you have any idea? Like, can you give me an idea, like you mean comparison with other studies?
Yeah, so what if you could give me a little bit about your
So,
topic?
for example, one of the research question is, it is not known if there is a significant relationship between flourishing and technology readiness of doctoral learners.
Okay.
So
that would be
the analysis is that okay, so you're suggesting, so this is something that you just came to my mind when you mentioned that. So you mean, should I start planning now how to interpret the data?
Yeah.
Like how to compare, contrast it with other studies?
No, how you're gonna analyze your actual data once you get your data in. So you haven't collected data yet, correct?
No, not yet.
So when you get that data, that fresh data, do you know what analyses you're gonna run yet?
Correlation, like, is that what you mean?
Yeah. So what you can start doing, and that's why I figured from your either correlation or linear regression. I was like, it's one of the two. So at this point, I mean, correlation is somewhat, straightforward to write up, but you can start beginning writing those sections and you can say, we tested a correlation between these variables, and then you can basically fill in the numbers and then extrapolate once you get it. So you can already have your R equals, and then just have it blank, comma, P equals, have it blank, and then fill it in later. So that's why I would say if you really want to get ahead in those parts, and you can also start thinking about maybe how you might format your correlation tables, or your correlation matrix. So if you're going to have a correlation matrix, you can think about that already. And I think that it can be really valuable to do that ahead of time too, because what happens sometimes, and not always at the dissertation stage, I would say, but what happens sometimes, especially if you're a researcher, you get to the point where you're like, the data comes in, but you're so busy doing other things that you're like, I don't have time to analyze this right now. But if you have the plan in place already, and you know what you're going to do and you know how you're going to write it up, that provides a bit more motivation to get it done once your data is there. So like, for example, like I can tell you before, like what I've done sometimes is I'll write up part of the results section ready to fill in with the data. And then, so I use multiple different statistical softwares, but one of the ones that I use is SPSS. And you can write up syntax in SPSS. So basically like programming language. And I've written that up beforehand so that literally the moment I download the data, I can just run that syntax and then get all my results like within that moment, basically.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I just, I was just thinking, because it's so easy to get out of the momentum. Like, it's so hard to get into the momentum, and then you get into the momentum, you get things done, you submit it, and then you wait again, and then I experienced losing that momentum. So I just want to keep on working ahead of things. I've been doing the PowerPoint for defense as soon as they approve it. And then, so I've done that. And then IRB, I prepared all the documents. So now I'm thinking, what else can I do?
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's a good way to be ahead of it and make sure that you're keeping on top of it and keeping your mind on it. Yeah, because you get those lag times where people are reviewing things, and you'll see it too with the IRB. They're going to take some time to get
Yeah,
back to you.
yeah, I heard
And
about that.
yeah, and yeah, so it's good to be able to find some ways to you know be able to get ahead and keep that motivation and that momentum. Yeah, I mean, sounds like you're really well prepared. And you might
Well,
hit a
I'm
point where
just
you
trying
don't
to
have
keep into
anything.
the, that momentum that I don't want to lose it again, because I experienced losing it, and then it's so hard to get back into it.
Yeah, yeah, I totally understand. I know I was same way. I lost my momentum a little bit, you know, and especially if you hit some hiccups.
Yeah.
But those are to be expected. And I think that one thing that somewhat gets lost in this dissertation process is because it's so stressful, is it is really about just ensuring and showing in many ways that you're capable of doing this and doing this research and exhibiting your own research project. And I mean, all of you are capable of doing that. And it's really about keeping that momentum up and figuring out ways to do it, whether it's getting ahead, or even sometimes I'll keep the momentum that I have going by just being like, okay, if this does work out how I hypothesize it, what do I want to do next? How can
Yeah.
I, you know, like, what's my next research study in this area? And yeah, I mean, sometimes you get a little ahead of yourself, but I think it's better to keep that momentum going, because
And
what
do the edits later on than have zero thing to start with.
exactly,
I'm
exactly.
thinking like, I can do a lot of the edits later on when the data comes in and replace all those words with the data. But those are my ideas. So I'm looking for people who have experienced it and see what they have to say about what to work ahead on. And
Yeah. No,
yeah,
that's
thank
excellent.
you.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. And yeah, I think it's one of those things too where it's important, like, you you're being trained to be a researcher and to be a professional in this area. And when you're in the mix of it, sometimes you forget that you didn't always think this way. You know, you weren't always approaching research questions this way, or you weren't always approaching journal articles this way. And when you're in the dissertation process and in PhD process, you're really thinking of the mind of a researcher, and you're questioning things, and you're thinking about hypotheses, and you're continually doing that. You're critiquing studies and saying, okay, how could I do this better? Or what could I take from this and make my research better? But that's a skill, and that takes practice, and that takes keeping that momentum up and making sure you're reading and thinking about these things and consuming them in a way that's productive.
That's true. Yeah. I look at my old papers from my coursework and I'm embarrassed to say, oh, this is how I wrote like 2 years ago.
I mean, I totally
I
understand,
have a
but
lot of claims that has no support.
yeah, and that's good, because that's growth, right? And that
Yeah.
shows that you're learning and doing better. And I can tell you, so it's like just a funny, like, aside, not aside, but kind of an anecdote based off that. So I'm working now at the institution where I got my undergraduate degree from. And I ran into one of my old professors, and he's like, I think I had you as a student. I was like, yep, you did, like over 10 years ago, you know. And he's like, I probably have some of your papers somewhere. And I was like,
Oh
please don't.
no.
Yeah, I was like, please leave them like in the filing cabinet or wherever you have them. I'd prefer not to read them right now. Yeah, that's great.
Excuse me. Okay, thank you so much for your advice.
Of course, happy. Any other questions I can answer?
Well, hearing none, I want to thank Dr. Corcoran again for his time and his presentation, and all of you for coming to engage in this discussion and ask about your research questions. We hope it was helpful. The recording will be available, and I believe Dr. Hernandez is going to be sharing it through the Facebook group. But if there are no other questions, I think we can go ahead and call it a night.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you all for having me. And yeah, if you do have any questions that come up or anything, my email is right there. Feel free to email me at any point.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Dr.
you all.
Corcoran. Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everyone.